This is a breaking news special report. Billions of dollars. That is the figure now sitting on the table between Washington and Ottawa. And tonight, we have learned that the United States has just realized it does not hold the cards it thought it did. Right now, inside the boardrooms of some of the most powerful consumer brands in America, financial teams are running numbers they hoped they would never have to run. The math, we are told, is ugly. And it is getting worse by the hour because Canada just made a move that nobody in Washington saw coming. It hit exactly where American industry is most exposed. We have been watching this trade war play out for months, and we can tell you tonight that the public narrative has almost completely missed what is actually happening. Everyone has been focused on the tariff headlines: who imposed what, which country blinked first, what the numbers were. But here is where it gets complicated. The real story is not the tariffs. The real story is what Canada did quietly, strategically, and with extraordinary precision, while the tariff debate was still dominating every front page. Canada controls something the United States genuinely cannot replace. And we mean that literally, not as political rhetoric, not as negotiating posture, but as a structural, physical, infrastructure-level reality that took decades to build and cannot be replicated on any timeline that matters to the current trade war. Let us give you the full picture. Canada produces roughly 3.3 million tons of aluminum annually. Most of it, more than 90%, comes out of Quebec, powered almost entirely by hydroelectric energy. This is not a coincidence. This is a century-old industrial architecture built around one of the most abundant clean power systems on the planet. When you run aluminum smelting on hydropower, you produce what the industry now calls green aluminum. Low-carbon certified ESG-compliant metal that meets the strictest environmental standards in the global supply chain. And here is what nobody is talking about. The United States needs this aluminum desperately. Reports are now confirming that roughly 70% of all aluminum imported into the United States comes directly from Canada. The US currently imports approximately 56% of all the aluminum it uses. It does not produce enough domestically. Its older, coal-powered smelting facilities cannot match the carbon standards now embedded in global procurement. And years of underinvestment have left American production capacity too thin to fill the gap. So when the trade war escalated, when tariffs on Canadian aluminum were raised from 25 to 50%, something unexpected happened. Canada did not panic. Canada adjusted pricing on certified green aluminum and let the market absorb the signal. And that signal just landed like a freight train on the US food and beverage sector. But that is not even the real story. Wait, it gets worse. Because the companies now taking the hardest hit are not obscure industrial suppliers. They are some of the most recognizable consumer brands in the world. Companies that move tens of billions of cans every single year. Companies whose entire sustainability framework depends on maintaining access to certified low-carbon aluminum. Companies that cannot downgrade their supply chain without triggering regulatory penalties, investor scrutiny, and the kind of brand damage that makes quarterly losses look manageable by comparison. Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, the giants of American consumer goods. They are now caught between a tariff-driven cost surge on one side and a pricing adjustment from Canada's strategic aluminum system on the other. We want to be precise here because precision matters. This is not a story about Canada randomly raising prices to be spiteful. This is a story about how one of the world's most underestimated economic actors quietly built a structural advantage that no tariff can undo, and is now using it with disciplined, calculated intent inside a trade war that the United States believed it had already won. Documents and industry data reveal that the United States simply does not have a viable alternative. China produces 60% of the world's aluminum. but it powers that production with coal. Coal-intensive aluminum fails the carbon certification requirements that now define procurement decisions across the global economy. European alternatives exist, but lack the volume. Other suppliers lack the infrastructure depth. Canada is not one option among many. Canada is the option. That is why what is happening right now matters so far beyond the aluminum trade itself. What we are learning is that in this trade war, the country that controls certified materials and the infrastructure behind them is not the country with the largest military or the loudest tariff threats. It is the country that built the right systems quietly over decades, while everyone else assumed the old power dynamics would hold forever. And right now, that country is Canada. Let us break down exactly what this move does to the US economy layer by layer. Starting with the pressure points no one in Washington wanted to acknowledge. Here is a number we want you to hold in your mind. Tens of billions. That is how many aluminum cans Coca-Cola and PepsiCo move through the US market and international markets every single year. Tens of billions. And every single one of those cans just got more expensive. Now, here's the part that keeps getting glossed over in the coverage we have seen. People hear aluminum can cost increase, and they think a fraction of a cent per unit. Who cares? But that framing completely misses the structural reality of how consumer goods margins actually work. Sources are now confirming what packaging industry insiders have been quietly flagging for months. When you take even a fractional cost increase and multiply it across tens of billions of annual units, you are no longer talking about rounding errors. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in annualized cost pressure, real dollars, margin compressing, earnings impacting, investor alarming dollars. And in a trade war environment where both companies are already absorbing tariff pressure across their broader supply chains, this is not a tolerable additional burden. It is a compounding crisis. But here is where it gets complicated, because the beverage giants cannot just pivot away from certified green aluminum the way another industry might be able to restructure a supply chain. Coca-Cola has publicly committed to using 35 to 40% recycled material in its primary packaging by 2035, with aluminum forming a core part of that framework. PepsiCo has similarly tied its sustainability architecture to clean material sourcing. Both companies are bound by investor-grade ESG disclosures that are actively monitored by institutional shareholders, regulatory bodies, and rating agencies. These are not optional public relations commitments. They are embedded in how these companies access capital, how they are evaluated by markets, and how they maintain the social license to operate at global scale. What this means in practice is that Coca-Cola and PepsiCo cannot substitute lower carbon certified aluminum for the cheaper, dirtier alternative without triggering a cascade of consequences that would vastly exceed any short-term savings. Regulatory scrutiny, investor downgrades, brand damage in European and Asian markets, where environmental compliance is not a preference but a legal condition. The substitution option that Washington's trade architects may have assumed exists. It does not. Not practically. Not at this scale. Not on any timeline that matters. And then this happened. The pricing shift from Canada's green aluminum system hit the packaging supply chain at exactly the moment when US companies have the least buffer to absorb it. The latest information shows that inflationary pressure from multiple tariff fronts has already compressed consumer spending sensitivity in the United States. Retail prices have been creeping upward across categories. Consumer confidence data has shown strain, and the last thing a beverage company can do in this environment is raise shelf prices on staple products. Because demand contraction on high-volume, low-margin goods like canned sodas does not recover easily. Once a consumer shifts behavior, they often do not shift back. So, you now have a classic trade war squeeze. Input costs rising from the supply side, consumer price resistance hardening on the demand side, and no viable short-term solution in the middle. Now, what we are about to show you changes the whole picture, because this is not just a beverage story. What is actually happening is that Canada's green aluminum pricing shift is exposing a dependency that runs through the entire US industrial ecosystem, not just food and beverage. Consider this. Automotive manufacturers depend on aluminum components. Defense procurement increasingly requires low-carbon certified materials to meet federal sustainability mandates. Renewable energy infrastructure, solar panels, wind turbine components, electric vehicle frames, all of it touches aluminum supply chains that run through Canada. When officials in Washington started reviewing the full exposure map, what they found reportedly produced significant concern inside federal policy circles because tariffs were designed to protect domestic industry. That was the argument. That was the premise. That was the political justification. But what the current situation reveals is that when you impose a 50% tariff on an input, your own manufacturers cannot replace domestically. You are not protecting them. You are taxing them. You are raising their production costs, compressing their margins, and making them less competitive against foreign producers who do not face the same structural tariff burdens. The US Chamber of Commerce has already made this argument publicly that the aluminum tariffs are hollowing out American manufacturing rather than protecting it. Ford Motor Company has disclosed it is paying tariff costs in the hundreds of millions of dollars related to Canadian aluminum from its Quebec smelter operations. Alcoa has reported similar exposure running into 9 figures, and those are just the disclosed numbers from major public companies. This is the part that kept us up last night, because here is the reality underneath the numbers. The trade war logic assumed that tariffs would create leverage, that pressure on Canada would produce compliance, that Canada would absorb the cost rather than create friction. That assumption was built on a reading of power dynamics that may have been accurate during previous trade cycles, but something has changed. And that change is not rhetorical. It is structural. It is baked into the physics of clean energy, the chemistry of certified metal, and the architecture of a supply system built over a century around Quebec's hydroelectric grid. Canada did not need to escalate. Canada did not need to threaten. Canada adjusted pricing within existing market and environmental compliance frameworks that the United States itself helped establish and let the consequences speak. And the consequences are speaking loudly all the way to the earnings calls of America's most recognizable consumer brands. Let us tell you what this is really about. Because if you watch the trade war coverage and walk away thinking this is a fight about aluminum, about metal prices and packaging costs, you have missed the whole story. What Canada is doing right now is sending 4 distinct strategic messages to the United States, to Europe, to Asia, and to every country watching this trade war unfold from the outside. And each message is more consequential than the last. But that is not even the real story. The real story is that Washington has not fully decoded the messages yet, and the time window to respond intelligently is shrinking. The first message is this: Canadian resources carry strategic value, not discount pricing. For decades, the operating assumption inside the US trade relationship with Canada was that Canada's raw material wealth, its timber, its minerals, its energy, its metals, would be priced at commodity rates that reflected volume, not leverage. Canada was treated as a supplier to be managed, not a partner to be respected. That era is over. Sources are now confirming that Canada's shift in green aluminum pricing is not a temporary adjustment tied to the current tariff cycle. It reflects a fundamental repositioning of how Canada's resource sectors value their outputs. Countries that control scarce infrastructure Dependent certified clean materials have pricing authority that commodity markets do not fully capture. Canada is now exercising that authority explicitly and doing so in a way that complies entirely with international trade frameworks, leaving Washington with limited retaliatory options. The second message: conditional access. Canada is making it clear that participation in clean supply chains requires respect for Canadian governance. The carbon standards embedded in green aluminum certification are not suggestions. They are enforced conditions that now carry trade policy weight across the global economy. Buyers who want access to certified Canadian materials must accept the pricing and compliance architecture attached to them. This is where the strategic logic becomes elegant. The United States spent years pushing global carbon standards, partly because American technology companies saw market advantage in clean economy frameworks. Now those very frameworks, embedded in procurement policies, investor mandates, and cross-border trade conditions, are being used by Canada to define the terms of access to resources Washington cannot source elsewhere. The architecture America helped build is now limiting America's leverage. The third message is perhaps the most psychologically significant one for Washington: refusal as a policy tool. Now, what we are about to show you changes the whole picture, because this one took the longest to register inside US policy circles. The previous US approach to trade negotiations with Canada operated on a specific assumption. That assumption was Canada will absorb friction rather than create supply disruption. Canada will take the pain quietly. Canada will not sacrifice short-term economic comfort for long-term strategic positioning. This assumption shaped tariff threats, negotiation timing, and the political calculus behind escalation decisions. Canada's current posture dismantles that assumption at the foundation by prioritizing long-term strategic positioning over short-term volume, and by demonstrating a willingness to let US industries bear the cost of unreasonable tariff structures. Canada has fundamentally changed the negotiating environment. Refusal is now a credible tool, and credible tools change behavior. The fourth message is the one with the longest shelf life: Canada controls the supply chain. Here is the thing about clean aluminum production that makes it different from almost any other strategic resource. You cannot build your way out of dependency quickly. New aluminum smelting capacity requires years of regulatory approval, capital investment, and infrastructure build-out, particularly if you want to meet the carbon certification thresholds that matter in global markets. The United States has been exploring domestic aluminum capacity expansion, but coal-dependent energy grids cannot support the certification requirements, and building new hydroelectric capacity on the scale Quebec provides is not a near-term solution. This means the physical control Canada holds over certified clean aluminum production is not a temporary advantage. It is a durable, structural reality. And once buyers across the global economy recognize that Canada's pricing reflects strategic intent rather than political habit, the terms of every future negotiations shift. Wait, it gets worse for the US position because the global reaction to Canada's move is already reshaping trade relationships that Washington was counting on remaining stable. In Europe, procurement offices are accelerating long-term contracts with Canadian aluminum suppliers. European regulatory frameworks already enforce strict emission standards, and Canadian green aluminum fits those frameworks precisely. The price sensitivity that might have been a barrier 6 months ago is declining sharply as supply security becomes the primary concern. European buyers are locking in now, which means available volume for US buyers narrows further. In Asia and the Middle East, sovereign wealth funds and industrial buyers are actively diversifying away from politically volatile supply chains. Canada's hydropowered aluminum system offers exactly the combination they are looking for: low carbon output, regulatory compliance, and insulation from the tariff shocks that make American-dominated supply chains unpredictable. The strategic math is being recalculated in real time by buyers across 3 continents, and the direction of that recalculation is uniformly unfavorable to the United States. What we are learning is that power in this trade war has shifted upstream. The country that controls the certified input, the country that holds the infrastructure, the certification systems, and the irreplaceable energy architecture sets the terms. Not the country with the largest GDP, not the country with the most aggressive tariff schedule, the country that built the right system quietly over generations and now has the discipline to use it. Canada built that system. Canada has the discipline, and Washington is only now beginning to process what that means. We want to be honest with you about something, because honest analysis matters more than a clean narrative. Canada's move is bold. It is strategically coherent. It is supported by real structural advantages that we have laid out across this entire story. But it is not without risk. And if you are going to understand where this trade war is actually heading, you need to see both sides of the ledger clearly. The first risk Canada faces is the most obvious one: direct trade retaliation that does not play by the rules of the aluminum fight. Historical data from previous trade war cycles shows that retaliatory measures rarely mirror the original action. They target sectors where political pain can be inflicted most efficiently. Washington has tools available: regulatory, slowdowns, procurement restrictions, pressure on adjacent Canadian exports, indirect tariff mechanisms that could be deployed against industries that have nothing to do with aluminum, but that would create real domestic political costs for Ottawa. Canada's government needs to maintain public support for this strategy, and sustaining public support through potential economic friction requires clear communication, coordinated domestic policy, and visible proof that the long-term positioning is delivering concrete benefits rather than abstract strategic wins. The second risk is diplomatic. Canada and the United States are not just trade partners. They share a defense alliance, intelligence infrastructure, border security cooperation, and economic interdependencies that run far deeper than any single commodity dispute. Sustained friction over aluminum pricing, even friction that is strategically justified, can complicate cooperation in areas where both countries need each other. Smart strategy manages these tensions simultaneously rather than treating them as separate conversations. The third risk is internal. Strategic pricing works only if domestic governance is disciplined enough to coordinate the industrial policy that supports it. If price increases on certified green aluminum create downstream cost pressure for Canadian manufacturers who depend on aluminum inputs themselves, the political coalition supporting this approach can fracture. Maintaining internal stability while projecting external firmness is not a communication challenge. It is a policy engineering challenge, and it requires exactly the kind of long-term institutional discipline that is easier to promise than to execute. The fourth risk concerns the credibility burden that comes with premium positioning. Once Canada establishes itself as a premium supplier of certified clean materials, it assumes responsibility for the reliability that justifies that premium. Any disruption, labor disputes, infrastructure failures, environmental events, political turbulence would carry amplified consequences. Markets reward consistency and punish uncertainty faster and more severely than any tariff announcement. Now, here is where it gets complicated, because the counter-argument to these risks is compelling. The alternative is worse. If Canada had maintained its previous posture, absorbing tariff shocks, underpricing strategic resources, remaining silent as leverage eroded, the trajectory was not toward stability. It was toward permanent structural disadvantage. A country that accepts undervaluation of its strategic assets does not achieve stability, it achieves dependency. And dependency in a trade war environment is not protection, it is vulnerability. Canada has chosen agency over habit. And in the calculus of trade war strategy, that is not a risky departure from safety. That is a necessary correction of an unsustainable trajectory. For the United States, the implications are uncomfortable, but clarifying. Tariffs were designed to reassert industrial dominance. What they have actually produced in the case of Canadian aluminum is a cost transfer onto American manufacturers, a compression of consumer goods margins, a strengthening of Canadian negotiating leverage, and a global realignment of supply chain relationships that is happening faster than any policy response can match. The US Treasury Secretary has already acknowledged publicly that aluminum tariffs are creating pain inside American industries. Ford is disclosing tariff costs in the hundreds of millions. Alcoa is absorbing 9F figure exposure. The US Chamber of Commerce has warned that the tariffs are hollowing out manufacturing rather than protecting it. These are not marginal dissenting voices. These are mainstream establishment-level acknowledgements that the tariff strategy is producing the opposite of its intended effect. Officials are now saying, at least privately, that the conversation has shifted from tariff escalation to supply chain security. That language shift is significant. Supply chain security means acknowledging vulnerability. Acknowledging vulnerability means recognizing that the leverage dynamic runs in both directions and that Canada holds a structural position that tariffs alone cannot overcome. For the global economy, the lesson being absorbed right now is precise and transferable. Standards have become power. Low carbon compliance, infrastructure depth, and supply chain reliability now carry more strategic weight than volume and proximity. Countries that can meet these conditions shape outcomes regardless of their size relative to larger partners. Canada's current posture demonstrates how a country can recalibrate influence without violating trade rules, without escalating rhetoric, and without military or financial coercion. The generation of Canadians entering the workforce right now is inheriting an economy that is no longer defined solely by extraction. They are inheriting an economy where value creation, clean industrial capacity, and strategic discipline form the foundation of national leverage. That shift has consequences not just for the current trade war, but for every economic relationship Canada will navigate over the next several decades. So here is where we land after working through all of this. Canada did not start this trade war. Canada absorbed the first wave of tariff pressure quietly and constructed a strategic response calibrated to structural reality rather than emotional reaction. The move on green aluminum pricing is not aggressive for its own sake. It is a precise application of real leverage exercised within established frameworks targeting dependencies that US industry had convinced itself did not exist. Whether this resolves quickly through negotiation or extends into a more complicated multi-year repositioning of the North American trade relationship will depend less on the boldness of Canada's strategy than on whether Washington develops the institutional capacity to understand what it is actually facing. Not a trade partner asking for concessions, but a sovereign economy asserting the value of what it built and refusing to subsidize imbalance through silence any longer. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.